President Trump made trade a cornerstone of his administration. So what will it look like now that he's no longer the president? What will it look like under a president-elect Biden? For more, we go to Chad Bown of the Peterson Institute of International Economics here in Washington, D.C. Chad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start, first of all, with what you perceive to be the biggest changes that we could see under a Biden-Harris administration when it comes to trade.
Well, I think the biggest difference will be that trade policy will be more cohesive, coherent, deliberative, thought out with longer strategic objectives. President Trump, seemed to be very fixated with the bilateral trade deficit the United States would have with countries. And for the most part, I think probably the president-elect, certainly virtually all economists don't think that that's a target that you should be aiming for. There are certainly problems out there in the world with some countries with which you have a bilateral trade deficit, but it's not the bilateral trade deficit in and of itself that tells you anything. So I think the sort of recognition of what the goals of trade policy, could and should be, I think that'll be first. And then the strategy to achieve it. President Trump used tariffs and very much went after things alone. And I think, listening to the Biden campaign and President-elect Biden, it sounds like their approach would be one in which they would work with other countries, like-minded countries, on areas of common concern. And so, they, for example, may share some of the concerns with China that the Trump administration did. But I think their approach would ultimately be very different, try to get other major economies, the Europeans, Japan, to work with them in ways that the Trump administration really just never did.
How does the U.S.-China relationship under trade change because we're more likely to have sort of a gang against China approach as opposed to a one-on-one battle?
In order to convince the Europeans, the Japanese, the other major economies, the economic allies, that you actually are serious about getting them to work with you, you've got to diffuse a number of bilateral tensions on trade that are both longstanding. So some things that, long predate the Trump administration, but then others that the Trump administration introduced along the way. The steel tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, that because we had largely stopped trade from China before even the Trump administration came along through other kinds of tariffs, when President Trump decided to impose tariffs, they mainly hit economic allies. They mainly hit, import coming in from Europe. So I think you'd have to resolve that as well. Europe retaliated, obviously, when we imposed tariffs. So you got to resolve those, I think, first, if you're going to try to convince the allies to work with you on this area of common concern.
How does the conversation around 5G and the infrastructure that Huawei has change in the U.S.-European relationship, if you can address those tariff issues in the short term?
The hard part thus far with the way the Trump administration has gone after Huawei, starting last year and into this year, is with these export controls, right? Putting limits on semiconductors and equipment for suppliers that want to sell these things to Huawei. And that includes not only the American, headquartered semiconductor companies, but also, for the most part, semiconductor companies in Asia. So in Taiwan, in South Korea. But the way they did that was very unilaterally. They imposed these export controls, first saying, American semiconductor companies couldn't sell to Huawei, but then telling equipment makers, that kind of provide the inputs to the manufacturers in overseas, that they also couldn't sell to Huawei. So basically telling, Taiwanese or South Korean or Japanese or European companies that they couldn't sell to Huawei too. And that's tricky business because they're going right after the companies and they're not working with the foreign governments. I would anticipate a Biden administration, you might have more attempts at not going directly after their firms, but going through their governments to try to get them on board with these kinds of policies.
I keep coming back to China, but obviously that's the juggernaut in the trade scheme for every country. Let's go to a question about the tariffs that we haven't discussed, which is the tariffs that really hurt American farmers on agricultural goods that came out of the pockets of farmers, but were often blamed, or at least the president would say they came out of the pockets of the Chinese. Do you see that those tariffs continuing under a Biden administration? And if not, how do they get unwound?
Between March of 2018 and the end of 2019, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on over $350 billion worth of imports coming in from China, kind of 2/3 of what we buy. And China retaliated by imposing tariffs on, close to $100 billion worth of US exports, more than half of what we sell to China. And for the most part, what China went after in their retaliation was, as you said, American agricultural exports. Soybeans, is the huge, huge piece of that. And that was devastating for the industry, or it would have been devastating. But President Trump and his administration rolled out tens of billions of dollars of farm aid, of subsidies, essentially, to kind of help the farmers that were suffering. So here we are. Now we have this phase one agreement that's been in effect between the United States and China since February. As part of that agreement, China has agreed to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of US exports over this year, so over 2020 and next year, 2021. And one of the things that I do is to track progress there. How much is China buying relative to what President Trump said they would buy? And thus far, they're not getting close. Now, to be fair, for the agricultural products, especially soybeans, those are late in the year products, right? They're not harvested until September, October, then they'd be shipped to China after that. And so there's a chance that China may get closer on the agricultural products as the rest of 2020 plays out. But they're certainly nowhere close on the manufacturing piece of this, on the energy piece of this. And so a President-elect Biden comes into office, one of the key questions he's going to confront is, what do you do with the phase one agreement? And what do you do especially about these purchase commitments? I just don't see much upside for a Biden administration following through with them. If China were to reach the $200 billion target by the end of next year, I think it would be, President Trump who got credit for it. And if China didn't reach it, the Biden administration would get blamed for somehow not being tough enough on China to get it to get there. So, yeah, that's I think an early one. We'll have to look and see, what their approach to that particular part of the relationship is. And I think getting rid of that might actually relieve, some political pressure on the two sides too, and actually get them to talk about some of the more substantive issues that are there in the relationship.
Another piece of the puzzle when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship with respect to trade that's going to push the Biden administration to have to make some decisions is this news that a China-led free trade agreement, the largest in the world, has now been signed by over 10 countries, and none of them is named the United States of America, and it's not even named India, but it is named there are countries part of this agreement that are allies of the United States. What kind of pressure does that put on the Biden administration to make a decision, which is actually pretty politically difficult for Democrats to make, which is to support a big free trade agreement when they have members of their own party, and I believe Biden's own transition team has people on it that are against the TPP, which is sort of the competitive agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump pulled us out of at the beginning of his administration.
The TPP in the United States, I think, is still at least politically toxic. So it's not as if it's going to be easy for a Biden administration to say, we'll just get back into that agreement that President Trump, pulled us out of, that the Obama administration had negotiated the rules over. President Trump has done an amazing job at convincing the American public that TPP is a 4-letter word and not a 3-letter word. But that being said, I think President Trump also showed how, with some deft political skills, you can just rebrand elements of trade, not make all that many changes to them, and suddenly they're the best trade agreement ever, right? And that's effectively what USMCA was, right? President Trump called NAFTA, the North American agreement, the worst trade agreement ever. He made minor tweaks to that thing, but it passed through Congress with flying colors. So there are definitely, I think, arguments, obviously, for the United States to re-engage in that region economically, and not being there, losing out access to some of these major markets is important. But I think it's going to require, a foreign policy strategy, which presumably a number of the Biden administration officials would be pursuing, because that was who was pushing this originally under the Obama administration. But then, the economics of this too seem to make sense. But it's going to require deft politics, I think, is certainly a big part of that story.
All right. Well, we appreciate your time, Chad Bown, there from the PIIE, the Peterson Institute of International Economics. Thanks so much for coming in and giving us your thoughts on what the future of trade policy could look like under the incoming president-elect.
Thanks for having me.
And if you'd like to catch up with any more Stansberry research content, please take a look at all of these social media platforms where you can find us. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. I'm Jessica Stone.